There is something happening inside the avoidant person right now, something building, something accumulating, something reaching point where it can no longer be contained or managed or rationalized away through the defensive narratives they've been constructing since the relationship ended. And that something is the slow, painful, inevitable recognition that what they did to you was wrong. Not wrong in abstract theoretical sense that they can acknowledge intellectually while maintaining emotional distance from the weight of it. Wrong in specific, concrete, undeniable way where they can see exactly what they did, can feel exactly how it hurt you, can understand with devastating clarity that the person who stood in front of them and loved them and gave them chances and showed them patience and offered them safety, that person deserved so much better than what they received. And this recognition is building towards something the avoidant has never done before, something that goes against every instinct their defensive system has developed over years of protecting them from vulnerability, something that terrifies them more than almost anything else they can imagine, because it requires them to do the one thing their entire psychological architecture was built to prevent: admit they were wrong, admit they caused harm, admit that someone they care about was hurt by their choices, and that the hurt was not caused by circumstance or by the other person's sensitivity or by the relationship simply not being right, but was caused specifically and directly by their own behavior. They're going to reach out. They're going to apologize. Not because you're waiting for it. You might not be waiting for it at all. Might have moved past the point where their apology would change anything significant about your life or your healing. Not because the apology will fix what they broke. It won't. And any genuine apology from someone with real self-awareness would acknowledge this rather than pretending words can undo sustained patterns of behavior that caused real damage over an extended period of time. They're going to reach out and apologize because the alternative, continuing to carry what they did without acknowledging it, continuing to exist with the weight of what they know they caused, pressing down on them without ever giving it voice, continuing to pretend they didn't hurt someone who didn't deserve to be hurt, has become more painful than the vulnerability the apology requires. The guilt has reached critical mass. The regret has accumulated beyond what their defenses can manage silently. The recognition of what they did has become too loud, too persistent, too impossible to ignore for them to continue operating as if it isn't there. And so, they're going to do the thing that terrifies them most. They're going to be honest. They're going to admit what they did. They're going to face you or face the space where you used to be, and they're going to say the words they should have said months ago or years ago. I'm sorry. I hurt you. What I did was wrong. You deserved better than what I gave you. And saying these words, actually forming them, actually sending them, actually making the choice to be vulnerable enough to acknowledge their own failure, is going to be one of the most difficult things they've ever done, because it requires them to surrender something they've been holding on to their entire life. The belief that they're not the bad guy, the narrative that their behavior was justified, the story they've told themselves that protects them from confronting the full weight of what their patterns have cost the people who love them. Why the apology is finally becoming unavoidable. For them, despite every defense, working to prevent it. The avoidant person has been resisting this moment for as long as possible, has been constructing every possible narrative, employing every available defense mechanism, doing everything within their psychological power to avoid reaching the point where apology becomes necessary. Understanding why the resistance is finally failing reveals the specific conditions that have created the situation where honesty has become more necessary than protection. The resistance fails because the guilt has reached saturation point, where it can no longer be managed through internal rationalization alone. For months, They've been telling themselves stories. The relationship wasn't right for either of us. She would have been unhappy eventually anyway. I needed space, and I had every right to take it. My patterns aren't my fault. They're the result of my childhood. These stories served purpose. They allowed the avoidant to function, to get out of bed, to continue existing without confronting the full weight of what they did. But stories have shelf life. They become less convincing with each repetition. They become less effective at managing the guilt as the guilt accumulates and deepens through continued reflection. The saturation point arrives when the stories stop working, when the avoidant tells themselves the relationship wasn't right, and their own internal response is, yes, it was, and you destroyed it. And at saturation point, the only options remaining are confronting the guilt honestly or allowing it to consume them from the inside. The apology becomes necessary because it's the only mechanism available for beginning to address guilt that internal rationalization can no longer contain. The resistance fails because they've started therapy, or they've had conversation with trusted person who challenged their narrative, and someone has gently but firmly reflected back to them what they already know, but have been refusing to acknowledge. The avoidant rarely arrives at genuine self-confrontation alone. Their defenses are too sophisticated, too deeply ingrained, too effective at preventing honest self-examination to allow it without external catalyst. But therapy creates environment where defenses are systematically examined rather than reinforced. Trusted friend who loves them enough to be honest creates moment where someone says, you hurt her and you know you hurt her, and the story you're telling yourself about why isn't serving you anymore. This external reflection doesn't create the guilt. The guilt already existed, but it makes denial impossible in ways that internal reflection alone couldn't accomplish. The apology becomes necessary because someone they trust has confirmed what they already suspected. What they did was wrong. What they told themselves about it was defense rather than truth. And continuing to defend against acknowledging this is preventing them from healing and from becoming the person they actually want to be. The resistance fails because they've encountered situation in new relationship or in their own life that mirrors what they did to you. They've been on receiving end of behavior similar to what they inflicted, and the experience of being hurt by someone else's withdrawal or coldness or emotional unavailability has made the impact of their own behavior suddenly visceral and undeniable. There's something about experiencing hurt from someone else's hands that makes the hurt you caused others suddenly real in ways it wasn't when it was purely theoretical. They feel the sting of being ignored. They feel the confusion of someone going cold without explanation. They feel the devastation of investing in someone who withdraws when things get close. And in feeling these things, they recognize with horrifying clarity that this is exactly what they did to you. The mirror of their own experience creates empathy that their defenses previously prevented, and this empathy makes the apology necessary because they can no longer pretend they don't understand what you went through while you were with them. The resistance fails because time has created enough distance from the acute fear that drove their withdrawal that they can now see their behavior with clarity that wasn't available while they were in the middle of acting it out. When they were withdrawing, when they were going cold, when they were creating distance, they were in survival mode. The fear was immediate and overwhelming, and their behavior was automatic response to perceived threat. But enough time has passed now that the acute fear has subsided, and in its place is quieter, clearer assessment of what actually happened versus what their fear told them was happening. They can see now that you weren't the threat their system told them you were. They can see that the withdrawal wasn't protecting them from danger, but was destroying something genuinely valuable. They can see that the fear was disproportionate to the actual risk, and that their response to that fear caused damage that the fear itself never would have caused. This clarity, available only with time and distance, makes the apology necessary because they can no longer honestly claim they didn't know what they were doing or didn't understand its impact. The resistance fails because they've recognized that carrying the guilt silently is actually preventing them from moving forward in their own life, that the unacknowledged harm they caused is functioning as anchor that keeps them tethered to the past while they're trying to build something new. Every new relationship they attempt is contaminated by the unresolved guilt about you. Every moment of happiness they try to experience is undermined by the awareness that they haven't acknowledged what they did to someone who deserved acknowledgement. The guilt isn't just about you. It's about who they are and who they want to become, and they cannot become the person they want to be while carrying unacknowledged harm that contradicts the person they're trying to grow into. The apology becomes necessary not just for you, but for their own ability to move forward, because forward movement requires honest acknowledgement of what happened before it, and they haven't provided that acknowledgement yet. What the apology will actually look like and what it will communicate beneath the words. The avoidance apology won't look like dramatic gesture or grand declaration. It will look like careful, vulnerable, slightly awkward communication that reveals both the genuineness of their regret and the difficulty they're experiencing in expressing it. Understanding what the apology will actually contain reveals what they're really trying to communicate beneath the specific words they choose. The apology will likely arrive through written communication rather than in person or by phone, because written communication allows them to craft what they're saying without the immediate vulnerability of real-time conversation where they might need to respond to your reaction. They'll text or email or message, something where they can think carefully about each word, where they can express what they need to express without being interrupted or challenged in the moment, where the vulnerability of admission is slightly buffered by the distance that written communication provides. This isn't cowardice. It's the avoidant's best available attempt at honesty, given their limitations. In person would require them to manage your emotional response in real time, which would likely trigger their withdrawal response. Written communication allows them to be honest without triggering the defense mechanism that in-person vulnerability would activate. The apology will begin with acknowledgement that what they did was wrong, not vague acknowledgement like "I'm sorry things didn't work out between us," which distributes responsibility equally and avoids actually admitting fault, but specific acknowledgement that their behavior caused harm. Something like, "I know I hurt you," or "What I did wasn't okay," or "You deserved better than how I treated you." This specificity is significant because it represents departure from the vague, responsibility-avoiding language the avoidant typically employs. They're not saying, "I'm sorry we couldn't make it work." They're saying, "I'm sorry I did what I did." The shift from passive construction to active acknowledgement of their own role reveals that the apology is genuine rather than performative. The apology will likely include specific acknowledgement of particular behaviors that haunted them most, the moments they couldn't stop replaying, the conversations where they knew they were causing pain and continued anyway, the times they chose withdrawal over presence when presence was what you needed. These specifics reveal that the apology isn't generic expression of regret, but is the result of sustained reflection about exactly what they did and exactly how it affected you. They've been thinking about these moments for months. They know which ones matter most. The inclusion of specific details communicates that they've been carrying these memories consciously, have examined them honestly, and are now acknowledging them rather than continuing to defend against their significance. The apology will contain admission that their behavior wasn't justified, that the narratives they constructed about needing space, or the relationship not being right, or you being too demanding, were defenses rather than truths, and that they know this now, even if they couldn't see it while they were living it. This admission is particularly significant because it requires them to acknowledge that they lied to themselves, that the stories they told themselves about why they behaved the way they did were protective fiction rather than accurate assessment. Admitting this requires level of self-honesty that's genuinely difficult for someone whose entire psychological system is built around self-protective narrative construction, and their willingness to make this admission reveals the depth of the shift occurring inside them. The apology will probably include statement that they don't expect anything from you in response. No forgiveness, no reconciliation, no acknowledgement that the apology has been received or appreciated. This statement is important because it communicates that the apology isn't transaction, isn't attempt to restore relationship, isn't manipulation designed to create specific response in you. It's simply acknowledgement of what they did, because acknowledgement has become necessary for their own integrity and for their own ability to move forward. They're not asking for anything. They're offering something, honesty, that they've been withholding for too long and that has become impossible to continue withholding. Beneath all the specific words, beneath the careful construction and the vulnerable admission and the acknowledgement of harm, the apology will communicate something deeper that they might not explicitly state, but that exists beneath everything they write. You mattered. What happened between you mattered. The way you loved them mattered. And the way they responded to that love, with withdrawal and coldness and patterns that caused real pain, was failure on their part that they're finally willing to own. The apology is their way of saying, I see you now. I see what you gave me. I see what I did with what you gave, and I'm sorry I wasn't capable of being worthy of it. Why this apology is so difficult for them and what their willingness to do reveals about who they're becoming. The avoidant person's decision to reach out and apologize represents one of the most psychologically challenging actions available to someone with their attachment style. And understanding why it's so difficult reveals the significance of their willingness to do it, despite the difficulty. The apology is difficult because it requires them to admit they caused harm, and admitting harm requires confronting the possibility that they're not the good person they need to believe they are. The avoidant has maintained self-concept as fundamentally decent person who simply struggles with intimacy, someone whose behavior is understandable given their wounds, someone who isn't intentionally cruel, someone who deserves compassion for their difficulties. Admitting they cause real harm challenges this self-concept because causing harm and being fundamentally decent person exist in tension that's difficult to hold simultaneously. The apology requires them to hold both truths. They are fundamentally decent person and they caused real harm without collapsing into either extreme of I'm terrible person or I didn't actually do anything wrong. This psychological balancing act is genuinely difficult and represents significant emotional maturity that they're demonstrating simply by being willing to attempt it. The apology is difficult because it requires vulnerability that their entire system was built to prevent. Reaching out to someone they hurt and saying, I hurt you and I'm sorry, is pure vulnerability. There's no defense available, no way to frame it that protects them, no strategy that makes the admission feel safe. They're simply exposing themselves to potential rejection or anger or indifference with no control over how you'll respond, no ability to manage your reaction, no way to protect themselves from whatever your response might be. For someone whose primary psychological strategy has been controlling their environment through withdrawal and distance, choosing to be completely uncontrolled and unprotected in this way represents extraordinary departure from everything they've relied on to feel safe. The apology is difficult because it means acknowledging they failed someone who deserved better, and this acknowledgement creates specific shame that's different from general guilt. Guilt is about what they did. Shame is about who they are in light of what they did. The apology requires confronting not just the behavior, but the identity question it raises. What kind of person destroys someone who loved them this genuinely? What kind of person fails to honor patience that was freely given? What kind of person couldn't sustain love that was offered without conditions? These identity questions are painful, and the apology forces them to exist without resolution because there isn't a clean answer that eliminates the shame. They can only sit with it, acknowledge it, and choose to be different going forward, despite the discomfort of knowing what they were capable of doing. The apology is difficult because they don't know how you'll receive it, whether you'll respond with anger, with indifference, with forgiveness, with silence. This uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for someone who typically maintains control through managing distance. They're choosing to act without knowing outcome, without being able to predict your response, without any guarantee that the vulnerability they're showing will be received in a way that feels okay. This willingness to act without control, to be vulnerable without guarantee of safe reception, reveals significant shift in how they're operating. They're choosing honesty over safety, choosing integrity over self-protection, choosing to do what's right, regardless of whether it feels comfortable or produces favorable response. What their willingness to apologize reveals is that something fundamental has shifted in how they understand themselves and how they operate in relationships. The person who withdrew to avoid vulnerability is now choosing vulnerability. The person who created distance to maintain control is now choosing to close distance without guarantee of safe landing. The person who constructed narratives to protect themselves from confronting harm they caused is now dismantling those narratives and confronting harm honestly. These aren't small shifts. They're evidence of genuine psychological movement, genuine willingness to become a different person than the one who hurt you. Whether this shift sustains, whether it leads to continued growth, whether it represents beginning of genuine transformation, or simply isolated moment of honesty that doesn't change their fundamental patterns, only time will reveal this. But the willingness itself, the choice to be vulnerable enough to apologize, despite every instinct telling them not to, this reveals a person who is trying, genuinely trying, for possibly first time in their life, trying to be honest about who they are and what they did and what they owe to someone they failed. How you should think about their apology when it arrives, and what it actually means for where things stand. The avoidance apology, when it arrives, will create specific emotional response in you. Might bring tears, might bring anger, might bring unexpected relief, might bring complicated mixture of feelings that are difficult to sort through. Understanding how to think about the apology when it arrives helps you respond in a way that serves your healing rather than reopening wounds or creating false hope. Their apology doesn't obligate you to forgive them. Forgiveness is a gift you give yourself. It's releasing the weight of resentment and anger so you can move forward without carrying them. Whether you forgive has nothing to do with their apology and everything to do with your own healing process. If you're ready to forgive, their apology might facilitate that. If you're not ready, their apology doesn't create obligation to pretend you are. You can receive their honesty, can acknowledge that their apology is genuine, can recognize the difficulty it took them to offer it, and still not be in place where forgiveness feels appropriate or necessary for your own peace. Forgiveness operates on your timeline, not theirs. Their apology doesn't mean they've changed. It means they've recognized what needs to change. Recognition and transformation are different stages of entirely different processes. They might recognize completely what they did wrong and still be incapable of sustaining healthy relationship because the wounds that drove their behavior haven't been addressed through sustained therapeutic work. The apology reveals self-awareness. It doesn't reveal new capacity. Before interpreting their apology as evidence they're now safe to be vulnerable with again, require evidence of sustained behavioral change over a significant period, not just recognition of past behavior, but demonstration of different present behavior. Their apology means you were right about the significance of what existed between you, right about the depth of connection that was present despite their behavior, right about the fact that what they did caused real harm that deserved to be acknowledged, right about everything you questioned during and after the relationship when their silence and their absence made you doubt your own perception of reality. The apology is confirmation that your experience was accurate, that your feelings were appropriate responses to real events, that you weren't imagining or exaggerating or being too sensitive. You were right. They know you were right. And their willingness to acknowledge this publicly, even if only to you through written message, is their way of confirming what you always suspected but needed external validation to fully trust. Their apology means you can release the specific pain of feeling unseen, the pain of having been hurt by someone who never acknowledged the hurt, who maintained silence about their role in creating damage, who left you to process the loss without any acknowledgement from them that loss was caused by their choices. The silence that followed the relationship ended was its own form of harm. It communicated that what happened didn't matter enough to address, that your pain wasn't significant enough to acknowledge, that they could move through the world without ever facing what they did. Their apology ends this silence. It doesn't undo the harm the silence caused, but it does close the specific wound that silence created, the wound of being invisible in someone else's story of what happened between you. You're no longer invisible. They see you now. They see what they did, and they're saying so. Their apology means you can finally close this chapter, not because their words provide closure by themselves, but because their acknowledgement removes the final piece of unfinished business that was keeping you tethered to the relationship. You've done your own healing work. You've built your own life. You've moved forward in ways that demonstrate genuine peace with however things unfold. The one thing that might have been lingering, the question of whether they ever understood what they did, is being answered now. And with that answer, the chapter that began when you first loved them and ended when you finally chose yourself can be closed completely, not with bitterness or with hope for reconciliation, but with quiet acknowledgement that something significant happened, that both people were affected, that harm was caused and recognized, and that life continues forward from here in directions that no longer require looking back. Their apology means something beautiful about who you are, about the kind of person who inspires genuine remorse in someone who has spent their entire life defending against the possibility that they could cause harm. They're apologizing because you are worth apologizing to, because what you gave them was significant enough that destroying it created guilt they couldn't rationalize away. Because the person you are, the patient, understanding, boundary-maintaining, genuinely loving person, made such deep impression on them that the failure to honor that person became unbearable weight they could no longer carry silently. You inspired this apology simply by being who you are, simply by loving them the way you love them, simply by being worthy enough that failing you became something they couldn't live with without acknowledging. That's not a small thing. That's evidence of your extraordinary impact on another human being, impact significant enough to crack open defenses that have been sealed for years, significant enough to motivate vulnerability from someone who has spent entire life avoiding it, significant enough to create the guilt and the regret and the recognition that finally brought them to the point where honesty became necessary. They're apologizing because you mattered. You mattered enough to crack them open. You mattered enough to make silence unbearable. You mattered enough that the person they want to become cannot exist alongside the person who hurt you without acknowledging the hurt. You mattered enormously, irreversibly, and their apology, however you receive it, whatever you do with it, whether it changes anything about your life or simply confirms what you already knew, is the most honest thing they've ever said to you. And it's the truest thing they've ever admitted about themselves. Accept it for what it is. Not an ending, not a beginning, but an acknowledgement, a finally seeing. A moment where someone who spent their entire life looking away finally looked directly at what they did and said the words that needed to be said. You deserve those words. You always deserve them. And now, finally, after everything, you have them. Their apology, however you receive it, whatever you do with it, whether it changes anything about your life or simply confirms what you already knew, is the most honest thing they've ever said to you. And it's the truest thing they've ever admitted about themselves. Accept it for what it is, not an ending, not a beginning, but an acknowledgement, a finally seeing. A moment where someone who spent their entire life looking away finally looked directly at what they did and said the words that needed to be said. You deserve those words. You always deserve them. And now, finally, after everything, you have them. But here is what matters beyond the apology itself, beyond the words they chose, and the vulnerability it took to send them, and the acknowledgement they finally provided. What matters is what you do with this moment, not in terms of how you respond to them, but in terms of what you allow it to confirm about yourself and about your future and about the kind of love you're now going to accept going forward. Because their apology isn't just about the past. It's not just about closing chapter or receiving acknowledgement you were owed. Their apology is also mirror reflecting back to you exactly what kind of person you are and exactly what you're capable of inspiring in other human beings. They didn't apologize to just anyone. They apologized to you, someone who made them feel guilty enough that silence became unbearable, someone who made them examine themselves honestly enough that defense narratives lost their power, someone who inspired genuine remorse in person, who has spent their entire life protecting themselves from the possibility that they could cause harm worth acknowledging. This isn't ordinary impact. This is extraordinary evidence of who you are. Evidence that the way you love, the way you show up, the way you exist in relationship with another person creates impressions so significant that even the most offended person eventually cannot pretend it didn't matter. Their apology also confirms something about the nature of love itself, confirms that genuine love, even when it's met with withdrawal and fear and patterns that destroy it, leaves mark that cannot be erased through time or distance or defensive narrative. You love them, genuinely, deeply, with full presence and full awareness of who they were and what they were capable of. And that love, even though it was met with behavior that made sustaining it genuinely difficult, even though it was repeatedly tested by their withdrawal and their coldness and their inability to show up consistently, that love created impression on them that nothing they did could eliminate. The love persisted in them even after you stopped giving it. It persisted as guilt when they recognized what they did with it. It persisted as regret when they understood what they destroyed. It persisted as the slow, inevitable accumulation of honesty that finally brought them to the point of apology. Your love didn't disappear when the relationship ended. It transformed into the force that made their silence unbearable and their honesty necessary. This is what genuine love does. It doesn't disappear when the relationship ends. It continues working, continues teaching, continues creating consequences that eventually demand acknowledgement, regardless of how desperately the person who caused harm tries to avoid that acknowledgement. What you should carry forward from this moment isn't gratitude toward them for finally apologizing, though gratitude might be part of what you feel, but rather deep, quiet, unshakable confidence in your own worth and in the standard you now carry. They apologized because you set standard they couldn't meet, and their failure to meet it became something they couldn't live with silently. This standard, the standard of being loved consistently, being treated with respect, being honored for the extraordinary person you are, isn't standard you invented or imposed. It's standard that exists simply because of who you are. You don't have to fight for it. You don't have to demand it. You simply have to be yourself, and the standard exists automatically, and anyone who cannot meet it will eventually either rise to meet it or reveal through their failure that they weren't capable of loving you the way you deserve to be loved. The avoidant revealed their inability. They acknowledged it. They apologized for it. And now you move forward, carrying the knowledge that your standard is real, is non-negotiable, and is the foundation upon which every future relationship will be built. The person who comes next won't need to be reminded of your worth through guilt or through the painful education that arrives too late. They'll see it immediately. They'll honor it consistently. They'll never require an apology because they'll never give you reason to need one. This is what you deserve. This is what you've always deserved. And their apology, that vulnerable, difficult, finally honest acknowledgement of what they failed to provide, is the closing confirmation that you always knew this, even when they couldn't see it. You always knew what you were worth. Now they know it too. And knowing it, truly knowing it, changes everything about what comes next for both of you.